Have you ever, found yourself wide awake at 2 in the morning?
Oh, staring at the dark ceiling. We have all been there.
Right. Just staring up, utterly convinced that some current problem you're facing is an absolute, complete catastrophe.
Mm-hmm. Your heart is literally racing?
Yeah, cortisol is just flooding your system. Your mind is spinning through every possible disastrous outcome. And at that moment, you are absolutely certain that your life or your career or your relationship is on the brink of total ruin.
It feels like an existential threat.
It really does. But then, you finally manage to get some exhausted sleep. You wake up, and by 2 p.m. that exact same afternoon, you look at that exact same problem and you realize it is entirely manageable.
Right, which is wild because not a single objective fact about your situation actually changed between 2 a.m. and 2 p.m.
Exactly. The only thing that shifted was, well, the physiological and psychological lens through which you were viewing the data.
It is a universally maddening human experience.
Yeah.
I mean, our brains possess this remarkable capacity to construct vastly different emotional realities out of the exact same set of circumstances.
For sure.
What feels like a life or death crisis in the middle of the night just reveals itself as a mundane logistical hurdle in the daylight.
Yeah.
We're constantly building entire worlds out of our assumptions, and we rely almost exclusively on our state of mind in any given moment.
Which brings us to a really fascinating text we are analyzing for today's deep dive.
Yeah, this is a great one.
We have a transcript of a sermon dated June 14th, 2026. It was delivered by Pastor Jared Harper, and it's titled More Than Meets the Eye.
Right.
And I want to say right up front, regardless of your personal background or your belief system, the mission of our deep dive today is to extract the core psychological and philosophical insights from this text.
Because there is so much to unpack there about human nature.
Totally. We are looking specifically at how the human mind processes incomplete information, how our perspective fundamentally dictates our reality, and, most importantly, how we can train ourselves to avoid drawing final, disastrous conclusions when we only possess a fraction of the facts. So let's unpack this.
Well, to understand that cognitive leap from a manageable 2 p.m. problem to a 2 a.m. crisis, we really have to look at the mechanics of what the brain does when it encounters a vacuum of information.
Right, when we just don't know something.
Exactly. And Pastor Harper frames this with a brilliant quote. He says, "Worry is like paying interest on a debt you might never owe."
Oh, wow. That is incredibly accurate.
Isn't it? The psychological mechanism at play here is that fear aggressively colonizes the negative spaces.
Right.
When there's a gap between what we explicitly know and what we do not know, the human imagination just defaults to disaster.
Which, makes perfect evolutionary sense. We are fundamentally wired for threat detection.
Absolutely. Survival of the most anxious, basically.
Right. If our ancestors heard a sudden rustle in the bushes, the brain that assumed it was a deadly predator survived. The brain that assumed it was just a gentle breeze got eaten.
Exactly. Our neurobiology actively rewards worst-case scenario planning.
But in modern life, that survival mechanism essentially short circuits. I mean, we expend massive amounts of cognitive and emotional energy fighting battles that haven't actually arrived.
Right, simply because our brains abhor a vacuum.
Yeah.
The text actually highlights a really vivid historical narrative to illustrate this cognitive trap. It points to an ancient account from the book of 2 Kings, chapter 6.
Okay.
It features the prophet Elisha and his servant. So the servant wakes up early one morning, walks outside, and is immediately confronted with the sight of their entire city, surrounded by the king of Aram's army.
So not a great morning.
No, a terrible morning. There are horses, chariots, and heavily armed soldiers everywhere.
Oh, man.
And the servant has a completely understandable, biologically appropriate reaction. His amygdala just hijacks his brain and he panics.
I mean, naturally.
Right. He runs back to Elisha crying out, "Oh no, my lord, what shall we do?"
Honestly, panic seems like the absolute only rational response when you step out to get your morning coffee and see a hostile military force camped on your front lawn.
Yeah, you would definitely drop the coffee.
It is the modern equivalent of logging into your bank account on a Tuesday morning, seeing an unexpected massive withdrawal that drains your savings, and immediately spiraling.
Right. You instantly think of bankruptcy, eviction, just total financial ruin.
Exactly. You see the immediate visible threat, and your brain just tells you the game is over.
But Elisha's reaction is what disrupts that natural spiral. He stays perfectly calm and tells the servant, "Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than who are with them."
Which grammatically and mathematically makes zero sense to the serf.
Zero sense. I mean, he has literally counted the soldiers. He knows the odds.
Yeah.
So Elisha prays for the servant's eyes to be opened. And suddenly, the servant experiences this massive shift in perception. He looks past the immediate threat and sees that the surrounding hills are filled with horses and chariots of fire.
Like a massive, previously unseen defensive force surrounding them.
Exactly.
But hold on, I do want to challenge the application of this for a second, because there is a real danger of interpreting this as some sort of mandate for toxic positivity.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Right. Because the servant wasn't hallucinating the enemy army. The threat was not an illusion.
No, the swords were very real. The chariots were heavy.
The danger of violence was imminent. So how does the text reconcile the very real necessity of acknowledging a dangerous threat without slipping into a delusional state of pretending everything is just fine?
Well, the source material is very careful to draw a hard line between profound trust and mere denial.
Okay, how so?
The text argues that true faith never requires a departure from reality. Looking at a deeply flawed, terrifying situation and just pasting a smile over it isn't faith, it's delusion. Harper supports this by pointing to other historical narratives in the text. Like, David didn't look at Goliath and pretend the man was short.
Yeah.
Daniel didn't get thrown into the den and pretend the lions were friendly vegetarians.
Right, they acknowledged the threat.
Exactly. And Jesus didn't pretend the political and physical realities of his suffering in Jerusalem weren't actually happening. Acknowledging the brutal facts of reality is the baseline requirement.
So the servant wasn't wrong to identify the army as a lethal threat.
Not at all. His error was not in seeing the problem. His critical cognitive failure was assuming that the visible problem he was looking at constituted the entirety of reality. He evaluated his ultimate fate exclusively through the lens of his present visible circumstances. He took a local, immediate data point and mistakenly assumed it was the global, permanent reality.
He let the facts he possessed completely blind him to the existence of facts he didn't yet possess. But that leads to a much deeper question about human behavior. If we are required to look at the harsh facts without denial, why do different people process the exact same set of harsh facts and produce completely different emotional and practical outcomes?
And the text dives directly into that psychological divergence. It references an account from the book of Numbers, chapter 13.
Okay, what happens there?
The narrative details Moses sending 12 spies into the Promised Land on a 40-day reconnaissance mission. And when the spies return to deliver their report, what is so striking is their complete consensus on the raw data.
They all agree on what they saw.
Yes, all 12 spies agree that the land is incredibly fruitful. They all agree that the cities are protected by massive, fortified walls. And they all agree that the current inhabitants are exceptionally strong. They actually describe them as giants.
So there is absolutely no debate about the facts on the ground.
None.
They all observed the exact same fortified walls and the exact same giant inhabitants. The data set was identical across the board.
The fracture occurs entirely in the meaning they assign to that data.
Right.
10 of the spies evaluate the massive walls and the giant people and conclude that advancing is a logistical impossibility. They say it's a guaranteed suicide mission. But 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, look at the exact same walls and the exact same giants and conclude that the objective is entirely achievable. Why? Because God is capable of fulfilling his promise.
So the raw data input was identical, but the interpretive output was polar opposites.
Exactly.
You know, you see this play out in the corporate world all the time.
Oh, all the time.
2 people working at the same company in the same department get called into the same office and are handed the exact same layoff notice.
Right.
They are given the same severance package and are entering the same terrifying job market. But one person walks out of that building experiencing absolute crushing defeat. They assume their career trajectory is permanently broken, and they just spiral into depression.
Yeah, they see the giants and give up.
Exactly. But the other person walks out, acknowledges the day as an absolute nightmare, but almost immediately begins processing the event as a necessary catalyst. They start looking at it as the forced push they needed to start the business they've been talking about for years.
And the fundamental difference between those 2 employees and the difference between the 10 terrified spies and the 2 confident ones is their interpretive framework.
Right.
Pastor Harper points out that the 10 spies engaged in bottom-up processing. They evaluated the ultimate goal through the lens of their current circumstances. They let the giant obstacle dictate what was possible. Joshua and Caleb utilized top-down processing. They evaluated their current circumstances through the lens of the ultimate goal. They started with the promise and let that overarching reality dictate how they viewed the obstacle.
It is the shift between letting the obstacle define the outcome versus letting the ultimate goal define the obstacle.
That is a great way to put it.
When the obstacle defines the outcome, a fortified wall means the journey is over. But when the goal defines the obstacle, a fortified wall is simply an engineering problem to be solved along the way.
Exactly.
But, I mean, translating that into actual practice feels incredibly difficult.
Well, it's so hard.
Right. When a crisis hits and your nervous system is flooded with panic, you can't just snap your fingers and casually choose to perceive invisible chariots of fire. How do we forcibly shift that perspective when we are in the middle of a literal meltdown?
Well, the text acknowledges that friction. It explores two narratives where individuals are deeply trapped in their own limited perspectives.
Okay.
The first is found in Psalm 73, written by a man named Asaph. And Asaph is experiencing a profound existential crisis driven by the sheer unfairness of the world.
Which is very relatable.
Highly relatable. He looks around and observes that corrupt, wicked people are actively prospering. They're accumulating wealth and living comfortable lives, while he, attempting to live with integrity, is constantly suffering and struggling.
Yeah, that would make anyone crazy.
Right. And the longer he fixates on this glaring disparity, the more bitter and deeply cynical he becomes. According to the text, his downward spiral is only arrested in verse 17, when he physically changes his environment.
Wait, really? Like a literal change of scenery?
Yeah. The text says his perspective shifted only when he entered into the sanctuary of God.
So a physical state change triggered a cognitive shift. He had to step out of the environment where he was compiling his negative data.
Exactly. And the second narrative requires a temporal shift. The text examines the road to Emmaus story from the Gospel of Luke.
Okay, I'm vaguely familiar with that one.
It takes place in the immediate aftermath of the crucifixion. Two disciples are walking away from Jerusalem, completely devastated. Their entire belief system has collapsed. An unrecognized Jesus falls into step beside them, and they summarize their grief with a crushing phrase. They say, "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel."
We had hoped.
Right. Those three words reveal their cognitive trap. They had the factual information of Friday's crucifixion, and based on that singular data point, they concluded the entire movement was a failure.
Because they lacked the information of Sunday's resurrection.
Exactly. They mistook a painful, temporary plot point for the permanent conclusion of the story.
But wait, let's look at the reality of Asaph's situation for a moment, the guy from the Psalm.
Okay, sure.
He steps into the sanctuary, takes a deep breath, and widens his perspective. He gets his aha moment. But when he walks back out of that sanctuary, the corrupt people are still rich.
That is true.
The unfairness of society hasn't been corrected. If I step back to get perspective on a terrifying medical diagnosis, the doctor's appointment is still looming on my calendar. The tumor is still there.
Right.
So isn't this entirely psychological, like a mental placebo effect to make us feel better while the house burns down around us?
That is the most rigorous challenge to this entire philosophy. And Harper actually addresses it directly through the book of Job.
Job is the guy who lost everything, right?
Yes. Job's story is the ultimate case study in catastrophic loss. He loses his wealth, his health, and his family. After enduring chapters of immense suffering and aggressively questioning the fairness of it all, Job finally speaks to God in chapter 42.
And what does he say?
He says, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." The profound insight Harper pulls from this is that Job never receives an itemized explanation for his tragedies.
So he never gets the why.
No. And the circumstances of his suffering aren't immediately reversed in that moment. What changes is his epistemological framework, his very method of understanding reality.
Oh, I see. God changes his awareness of the universe rather than immediately changing the circumstances of his life.
Exactly. The peace Job finds does not originate from the erasure of the threat. It originates from achieving a broader awareness of his place within a much larger reality.
Right.
When Asaph exited the sanctuary, his external circumstances were indeed identical, but his internal field of vision had widened. He was suddenly able to perceive a longer timeline and a vastly bigger picture than the immediate moment.
That makes a lot of sense.
True stability, the text argues, does not come from micromanaging and controlling your immediate circumstances. It comes from trusting a broader reality that you acknowledge you cannot fully see.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of trust. Because we can analyze this intellectually all day.
Right, it's easy to talk about in a studio.
We can acknowledge that our brains lack complete data and that we shouldn't default to panic. But practically speaking, how does the text suggest we operationalize this kind of unwavering trust in the chaotic, messy reality of daily life?
Well, Harper grounds this concept using remarkably mundane, modern analogies to highlight how frequently we already practice this kind of implicit trust.
Like what?
Consider the act of driving a car. You are hurtling down a concrete highway at 70 miles per hour inside a heavy metal box.
Right.
If a driver in the next lane suddenly swerves directly into your path, you do not pause to mentally calculate the hydraulic pressure required in your brake lines to safely decelerate.
No, you just slam your foot onto the brake pedal.
Exactly. You are placing complete implicit trust in the unseen mechanical engineering of the vehicle to preserve your life.
We surrender control to the mechanics of the car without a microsecond of hesitation.
We do the same thing with the financial system. We implicitly trust that exchanging digital numbers on a screen will secure our housing, our food, and solve the vast majority of our daily friction.
That's so true.
We possess an enormous capacity for implicit trust. Yet, Harper points out, the absolute second we are confronted with a relational, emotional, or spiritual crisis, a scenario where our visible tools like brake pedals and bank accounts are entirely useless, that natural capacity for trust evaporates.
Wow. It really exposes the hypocrisy of human nature, doesn't it?
It really does.
It highlights the massive gap between the philosophical beliefs we claim to hold and our actual physiological reactions when tested. We love the idea of trusting the journey. We tell our friends that everything happens for a reason and that there is a bigger picture.
Oh, we say it all the time.
But the millisecond our visible, tangible resources are depleted, we regress straight to the panic of Elisha's servant. We demand to see the blueprints of the universe before we are willing to take a single step forward. We demand the chariots of fire be made visible before we are willing to exhale.
And Harper uses that contradiction to pose a vital question about the nature of strength and intervention.
What's the question?
Where is true power actually demonstrated? Is it only revealed when the universe magically alters our circumstances and the problem vanishes?
Right.
Or is power equally, if not more profoundly, revealed when an individual is sustained through an unbearable circumstance without losing their internal peace?
That is a heavy thought.
The ultimate takeaway of the text is a call for deep intellectual humility. Human perspective is inherently unavoidably limited. We are constantly reading a single page in the middle of a massive, complex novel and arrogantly assuming we know exactly how the final chapter ends.
Yeah.
We only ever possess a tiny fraction of the overarching story.
We are writing a review for a 3-hour movie based entirely on a single out-of-context screenshot.
Yes, that is a perfect analogy.
So, to distill the core mechanics of this deep dive, as human beings, our neurobiology makes us heavily prone to projecting grand, sweeping judgments about our entire future based solely on the data we can see in our immediate present. When we lack the full picture, our brains rush to fill the void with catastrophic scenarios. But Pastor Harper's text serves as a psychological pattern interrupt.
Right.
It reminds us that the immediate visible battles surrounding us, the fortified walls, the terrifying medical results, the unexpected layoff, is rarely the complete picture.
And the practice is learning to recognize the limits of our own perception. It is the active choice to widen the cognitive lens rather than allowing our focus to narrow entirely on the obstacle blocking the path.
So the next time you find yourself staring down an overwhelming obstacle, whether you are anxiously prepping for a massive, high-stakes meeting that could make or break your career, or you are furiously trying to catch up in your field and feeling totally outmatched by your peers.
Or dealing with personal news that feels like an invading army.
Right. Dealing with a piece of personal news that feels like an invading army camped on your lawn, remember the cognitive trap of Elisha's panicked servant.
The facts of your situation are real.
Yes. The obstacle is not an illusion. You do not have to pretend the threat doesn't exist. But those facts are not the whole story. You are never as isolated or as out of options as your flooded nervous system is trying to convince you that you are. There is always more happening beneath the surface than meets the eye.
It is a critical reminder to pause, regulate your response, and refuse to allow a temporary circumstance to dictate a permanent conclusion.
Which leaves us with one final, incredibly practical thought to chew on. We explored how, from an evolutionary standpoint, the human imagination naturally drifts toward disaster in those dark spaces between what we explicitly know and what we do not know.
Okay.
But neuroplasticity tells us we can rewire our cognitive habits. What would happen if you actively, intentionally trained your brain to fill those unknown gaps with best-case scenarios instead?
Oh, I love that.
Right. If the nature of human existence means you are inevitably forced to invent the unseen elements of your future, why not imagine them working in your favor?